Hi everyone again. I'm the community manager for Botmock. My name is Yuli, and I'll be introducing our wonderful panelists for today and our moderator. So let's start with Taylor. Taylor is a senior UX and conversation designer at Interactions. Before his jump to the private sector, he built his professional background researching, designing, and implementing citizen experiences in the civic sector. He holds a Master of Science in UX Design, has worked with teams at Microsoft, Sherwin-Williams, and KeyBank. In his free time, you can catch him fangirling over the latest SpaceX news, surfing around San Diego, and playing in LGBT plus rec league sports. Our next speaker is Anne. Anne's curiosity about how humans talk to each other and to technology led her to a PhD in cognitive science and linguistics, and then onto a career in voice UX UI. Her roles have spanned usability testing, design and data analysis in research and development, product development, and professional services organizations. She's been at Nuance, Amazon Lab 126, and several small startups. Currently the director of UX UI design at Luz Canon Systems, working on Milo, a new multimodal communication device. She spent the pandemic wrapping up her co-authored book, Mastering Voice Interfaces. Woo. Amanda is our last speaker. Amanda Stevens is the director of conversation design, leading the conversation design team at Master of Code Global, a conversational AI firm with 5 offices worldwide. Her love of linguistics, seamless user experiences, and technology led her to designing conversations. She has worked on and launched chat experiences for a multitude for channels, including SMS, Apple Messages for Business, Messenger, Google Business Messages, web, and apps. Her work includes designing experiences for large and enterprise-level brands across an array of industries, including telecom, retail, beauty, and insurance. And again, welcome to today's October AMA from Botmock, how to conduct user research for chatbots and voice-based products. Let's welcome our moderator for today, Brielle Nikolov, head of product for Botmock.
Thank you, Yuli. All right, so let's just jump into the questions. We got some great ones submitted. Thanks for the applause, Rick. Okay, so let's start with kind of a broad one. Amanda, if you want to start us off, and then we can go to Taylor and then Anne. What key things should conversation designers understand about user research in order to better partner with researchers?
Sure, this is a really good question. So before we even think about researching, it's so important to identify what is the problem. And as conversation designers, we need to make sure that whatever we design includes a lot of empathy. So we need to make sure that when we align with researchers, we're figuring out a problem, and it's not a business problem, it has to be a user problem, right? If we're not addressing user problems, we're probably not going to use the solution as much as we would want them to. And make sure that we're aligned on empathy, leading with empathy. You know, this is going to be a conversational experience. We need to be empathetic to users' goals, users' problems, users' pain points. So I think having that alignment right from the get-go will make sure that the research is on track and that it's going to address the problems of the users for the channels that we want to design for.
That's a great answer, Amanda. Really quick, can you explain what you mean, just for anyone who may not be familiar, for the difference between a user problem and a business problem?
Yes, great question. So a user problem could be struggling to complete a task or, do a transaction because of whatever system they're using today. If it's a website or app, it's clunky, it's buggy, they have issues, or they don't, it's not a clear user experience. Like the UI isn't very clear. A business problem could be, hey, we want to make more money. Let's do all the things to make sure we make more money. So, if you improve a transactional journey and more users use it, yeah, you could increase your revenue. But the way you have to approach the problem is, what are users having issues with? And because it can dictate what you focus on and what you prioritize, instead of just focusing on what does the business stakeholder, if they want to have a certain bar graph that looks a certain way or certain metrics that they want to achieve, your research can deviate from actually solving a problem and just creating something that, again, users might not want to use.
Yeah,
hopefully that was clear.
well, that's a great explanation. And it I've seen as well when that investment is spent up front to actually decipher whether you're solving a user problem or business problem.
Yeah.
You can often, put together a case for, this user problem. If we fix it, now it turns into a business problem that we're solving as well. So
yeah. Actually, I'll give you a good example. It just came to me. So working with a client, they want to increase containment and engagement on the bot. And they're like, we want to have as many people chat with this bot as possible. But the bot can only do like 5 things. So, it'll make the metrics look good that so many people are coming to this bot because, like they have to talk to a bot before they get to a human, like no matter what they ask. And that addresses a business problem, like having more people interact with something. But if you're opening the floodgates on your entire user base that will engage with a conversational solution that can only do like a few things, but the things that they're asking for are, in the hundreds, that's not great, right? You're directing people to a solution that isn't going to serve the vast majority of them. So that's not solving the user problem. That's not prioritizing, research and use cases to address like all the different things users are asking. It's just addressing a business problem that, hey, like, look at all the people talking to our chatbot, even if they'll either have a bad experience or they're going to escalate right away. That's not great.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Great example. It looks like Anne is having some internet issues, but she'll pop back in. So Taylor, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Amanda said. I would add to it that I think oftentimes like UX research and UX researchers as like a niche or as like a specialty within UX design often gets overlooked. And so I think like conversation designers, so I think they need UX research and UX researchers needs to be viewed as like a specialized group. And I think that's important because I think the good ones tend to be highly skilled at neutrality and at the process and in the process of asking questions to uncover truth, and doing so in a way that has a lot of patience, which I'm honestly not so great at. So I'd say to any conversation designer who wants to have a better partnership with researchers is to actually let researchers be researchers. Be open-minded to their feedback on your methodology, and specifically work with them not only to craft the questions that you want to ask, but specifically work with them to craft like how you want to ask the questions rather than what.
That makes sense, Taylor. And you've worked in a few different environments on conversational products. So in your experience, how often have you seen that like the research process is kind of thrust on the designers or maybe the product person, and how often is there really dedicated at least one researcher?
Yeah, it's funny, like it definitely varies widely from company to company. But it's funny, even at large companies, what we found was that because the company is larger, there was actually more need for user research. And even if you had a small team of dedicated researchers, they never seem to have enough capacity to actually carry out all the projects. And then vice versa, at smaller companies where maybe we don't have a dedicated team of UX researchers, maybe we're outsourcing it if we have the budget to do it. Or is more often the case, it does get thrust on the designers to take that role. In that case, like ideally you can find like another member of your design team that can step up and be your like facilitator for research, just to add a little bit more neutrality or another perspective. But I think you're right, Brielle. I mean, oftentimes it gets laid in the lap of designers when as I said, I think it's a really specialized skill.
Yeah, okay. We will come back to Anne for this one, but let's see, kind of leading into the next one, Taylor, can you kind of outline the steps that you or your team take when conducting UX research? And maybe, you just alluded to sometimes you'll outsource it. So how does that process look different when you're doing it internally versus externally?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question by sort of like trying to list like the things that we usually look for or need to get research going. And I think it always starts with assumptions, right? Having a list of assumptions that you want to either validate or invalidate, to ultimately test or uncover. I think it starts with that, and I think actually one of the hardest parts about assumptions is actually like coming up with like a strict or narrow list of ones that you're going to reasonably test within a study. I think it's easy to come up with a list of a dozen questions you have, but it's a lot harder to narrow that to like one or two that you're going to focus a study around. So usually I think we start with assumptions. At that point, once you know what you want to test, you can start thinking about how you're actually going to run that test. You can start exploring different methodologies for doing it. And as you think about that, I think it's also important to think about the types of data in which you intend to collect, whether it is quantitative or qualitative or ideally a combination of both. Once you have those assumptions, you have that methodology that you want to use. At that point, you can start thinking about test participants, how you might want to recruit them, whether it is through a third party, or if you don't have a budget and you need to recruit a bunch of friends to interview, that's okay too, but you want to start thinking about participants. From there, like as I mentioned about the UX researcher, you want to find a willing researcher or facilitator, someone again who's neutral, who can come in and offer a little bit of outside perspective. In the case of, let's say that you're running like usability or some sort of user research interview, at that point you'd want to compile a script, line by line of all the questions you're going to ask and sort of show your process a little bit further. And then the sixth and the last thing that I would mention that I think is often overlooked is making sure that you have a post-research plan for how you intend to compile all the information. I can't tell you how many research studies I've been a part of where that wasn't considered ahead of time. And we collect all this amazing data, and then at the end of the study, we're so utterly overwhelmed with how to actually process it. So I think it's really important that before you run the study, think about how you're going to compile the report afterwards.
Thanks, Taylor. Amanda, how does your process look? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I love everything you said, Taylor. And I especially love the post research plan, because you're right. You have all this data and it's like, now what? Do we just iterate and like do it again? Or do we do another prototype? Do we keep prototyping until we get, we're perfect? And so I love that you said that, because I too have been in that situation where it's like you have so much data and you're like, okay, what now? Like, what's that feedback loop look like? How many rounds of iterations are we going to continue to do on the prototype? So yeah, it's very much aligned with what Taylor said. Again, I think it's super important to like lead with empathy on this when you're taking, going down the path of research and look at data. Just to add to what you said, Taylor, I think, make sure that, when it comes to voice or, designing or building for a voice solution or a chat solution, that your research is the same channel that you are building and designing for. So looking at chat transcripts to inform a voice solution, that's not going to work. People chat differently than they speak. So it's really important to make sure that your data is one-to-one with, the same environment that people are going to be in when they're engaging with the solution. Also, from research, making sure that you really understand current state. If you don't know current state, you can't build something or design something that's going to be better. So that's where customer journey maps come into play from your research, right? You build out those personas, as Taylor mentioned, but also making sure you really understand current state, because what you need to design, it has to be better. If it takes 5 steps to do something on a website and you make a chatbot that's going to take 5 or 6 steps to do it, why would people deviate from current state to go to something that's not as efficient or not more efficient or doesn't offer additional value? So I would say just make sure that you really understand current state to inform something that's going to be even better.
That makes a lot of sense. Regarding the post-research plan, that I am really interested in that too. Taylor, do you actually outline in that plan how many iterations you're going to be doing, like Amanda mentioned? Like what kind of components are included in that?
Yeah, I mean, it really has so much to do with the scale of the study that you're seeking to undertake. You know, in the case of, I don't know, say you're doing research purely for like persona creation purposes, you know, and you know that you're going to be conducting like a large series of interviews to better understand your various users and create personas that reflect them. You know, let's say that you work for like, I don't know, a large bank, right? And you have this enormously large, diverse set of users, you know, that could break out into a dozen or more different personas. I think that's a perfect example of a time when you'd want to consider like this iterative approach, where maybe you start thinking about how you can, before doing the research, group those users based on, again, assumptions. And then maybe like the goal is to like sample, where like every week I'm going to interview 4 to 5 people, you know, compile those results. Next week, do the same thing, and go on and on and on.
Okay, and you're interviewing them, asking them questions about, you know, did this experience solve the problem that you had, like those kinds of questions?
Yeah, if the goal was to better understand like a product that was already in production or live, I think that would make sense. In the case of like persona creation, I think you'd want to ask them more questions about their actions and their environment, and you know what they see, think, and do, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Amanda, would you kind of include those extra iterations in yours?
Yeah, and to kind of speak to your question about, you know, how do you decide like how many more times you're going to iterate or maybe update the prototype? It could also just be it's as simple as, you know, from a prototype perspective, what percentage of our users you know, could complete the tasks or could find the thing they were looking for, or, you know, and if it's only half, we have to do better. We can't be launching, you know, I don't think it's completely ideal to, you know, keep iterating until all your test groups do everything 100%, but it has to be quite high, maybe 75, 80, you know, 80+% of completing the task and looking for areas of friction. If, you know, if there's multiple points of friction in an experience, you have to iterate on that, because if people have too many areas of friction, they're going to just leave or they're going to escalate. So yeah, I think that's also really important to look at, just from the prototype piece of it. You know, did they do the thing? Could they find the thing? And then go from there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're back.
Hope so.
Hello.
It figures we have no internet connection today.
No worries. We're just gonna go back to that first question. We're only on the second.
Okay.
So we didn't miss anything. So for you,
Mhm.
what key things do you think conversation designers should understand about user research in order to actually better partner with researchers?
Yeah, that's like Amanda said, it's a great question. I think the key thing is to understand how to ask questions, the right questions, and present the tasks in a way that, you know, so you don't influence the participant. If you're actually doing the UX research usability testing yourself, you have to be sure to practice on the, you know, the presenting of the task in such a way that you're not kind of leading the witness, right? Not influence the participant. That's very tricky, right? And be sure to be really concrete with everything you do. You know, rely on observing behavior more than participants' answers to things. I mean, it doesn't mean you don't listen to what they comment, right, and their opinions, but you want to make sure always to track your data source. So is it their speculation and their opinion, or is it something that you observed? And just make sure that you kind of make a note of where it comes from, because it's all about strength of evidence, right? Is it valid? Is what you're observing, is it actual? Where did the data come from, and is it valid? Because you're going to use this to make your decisions for design and things like that. So.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So not asking questions that are going to give you the answers that you're looking
Yeah,
for.
exactly.
Which is easier said than done.
Yeah, no, exactly.
All right. So let's see. Anne, maybe you could start us off one as well, and then we can go to Amanda. What are the key points to focus on when conducting research for voice-based products?
I think, yeah, it's almost like the flip side of the previous question, like kind of what each one can learn from each other. It's really important to understand what makes voice special, both for the human and for the computer, right? So that you, especially when you're doing your research, you want to make sure that you're picking up on what happens and why. I have an example of this from a long time ago, so I'm not picking on anybody currently, but a long time ago, I was observing somebody who was a very skilled senior trained UX practitioner, but didn't have any speech voice background, do a moderated voice study, and realizing that that person kind of missed a lot of opportunities to ask follow-up questions and were not quite as effective as they could have been if they understood more about the technology and about what makes voice special, what makes spoken language different from other things. So that would be kind of one of my first key points I would want people to think about.
I realized that was a while ago, but is there any chance you remember what kind of missed opportunities those questions?
Oh man. No, I think it was more kind of as somebody who knows more about the voice technology and so on, I had a good sense of what went wrong for this particular participant, and I would have been probing on that, but instead the person who was leading it just kind of moved on as, okay, it didn't work, let's go to the next thing, right? So it was that sort of thing. That's all I remember. So it's more like just knowing more about the actual technology made it so that I would have sort of poked further at some specifics about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, Amanda, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I love what you said, Anne. I think just to add, again, just if you're doing research for voice, make sure you get data and actual voice transcripts, and look at data in the same channel you're designing for, and also really dive into the environment that you're going to be designing and building, because that will help inform your design. So recognizing like chat is an asynchronous experience, but voice is synchronous. So that again, I think helps you inform, how you ask your questions, the environment, or like the way you test or give prototypes to your users. And also just recognizing the challenges with voice around, okay, there's cognitive load that we have to think about. There's also different dialects of folks who, of our users that might be using the solution, or different pronunciations, and recognizing those, pieces, those factors that are very important to the design informs, okay, we need to make sure if we have a large user base, like of our user personas, are my testers diverse enough? Are they covering all those like pieces that we outlined in the user personas? Is it a wide array? Like, are the customers of the brand that we're looking at quite large? Well, then let's make sure our users are diverse, because pronunciations are going to be critical in, how they interact with the experience, or dialects, or what have you. It depends, of course, on the brands, the users. But I think just to add, really understand what are the key features of voice, what are the core competencies, but what are also, voice doesn't have visual aids. Voice, again, not like people can struggle with engaging with an assistant when you have like different accents, like I mentioned before. So just really understanding the core competencies of the channel, and also the potential challenges that you have to work through.
Yeah, those are good points. I mean, there's a whole other element when you are dealing with voice where, what you see on the transcript may not actually have been what you got, because it could have been completely misheard, and there's a lot of different ways that can happen. So yeah, brought up good points.
Thanks.
I just thought of a question that is a bit of a curveball, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, So I'm going to ask it, and then maybe in a while we can come back if anyone feels like answering it. So much of conversation design is choosing the correct intent model, or organizing your intents in a way that will actually line up to what your users will be asking you. So I would love to know how you all conduct research specifically around the intent mapping upfront to determine like whether those intents you chose are actually serving your users. If anyone has an answer right now, we can do it, but we can also wait.
Yeah, I'll circle back on the one. I'm gonna think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, same.
Cool. Okay. All right. So next question that is not a curveball. Taylor, what are some strategies for conveying that a bot you built is not all-knowing and really is just starting out? For example, that users should lessen their expectations.
Yeah, this is a question that I think comes up a lot, actually. And I would first start by saying that as a principle, I think that you should always be transparent and honest upfront about what the bot can and cannot do. I think anything other than that is inevitably going to lead to user frustration, and ultimately a bad experience. That being said, I don't think it means that, in your opening message, you should be like, hi, I'm the so-and-so bot. Like, I can do this, that, and the other thing, and that's all I can do, right? I don't think that's the right way to do it either. I think there's maybe more subtle ways that you can help a user along or infer the functionality or capabilities of the bot. One of the common ways that people do that is through like suggestion chips, right? Having buttons to sort of help guide the user through what the bot can and cannot do. Another way to do it is, let's say, the user says something and it triggers a no match because the bot's just not built for it. I think you can provide a resource at that point that, lays out the capabilities of the bot. And I think, like, when I think of examples of chatbots that actually do that really well, not to like name companies, but, Bank of America's Erica is really effective in laying out the capabilities of their bot. I think, like, in the upper right corner, they have a little information tab, and at any point in the chat you can click it and just get a really efficient list of like what Erica's even capable of. So I think those are good strategies for how to handle that sometimes difficult area of, maybe my bot's not super functional, but it's still useful for some things.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts on this? You're muted. If you're
sorry, I was trying to get my connection back again.
Oh, no.
Why don't you skip on to Amanda for right now? Sorry.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so Amanda, strategies for conveying that a bot is not an all-knowing entity.
Yeah, exactly what Taylor said. Set user expectations. Do not make assumptions about the user. And if the bot is all-knowing, you should have an escape hatch. You should have a live agent behind there. If they're there to chat and they're getting frustrated and you're like, hey, call this number if you're having issues. Now they're, now they're gonna have to call someone. I'm already chatting, maybe I'm on the go. So just make sure there's good points of escalation there to mitigate additional frustration. Not every bot has a live agent attached to it, but if you want to make it human-centric and you want to have those good user experiences, make sure there's, help not very far away.
That's preferable if the next point, oh, we can see you, Anna.
Yeah, for now. I might be overly optimistic here. But I basically agree very much with what Amanda and Taylor said. That is exactly the way to do it. Find a way to back off. Offer back offs. You can do it kind of in stages too, right? To say you sort of know something about what they're saying, so don't just kind of go back to, gee, I don't know what you're talking about, but try to get something out of try to understand something about whether it's the text or voice, doesn't really matter, right? but have some sort of clever back off that you're offering up something. And just keep in mind that the style of your app bot implementation will, influence what a person will say in response, right? Or type in response, especially for spoken stuff, right? If you have a very sort of chummy and formal, sort of standard human way of talking to the user, then they are going to respond in the same way. So you better be prepared, right? You have to live up to expectations.
Yeah, great points. And we'll start with you on this next one. How do you conduct remote user interviews for voice-based products when you have concerns of technicality and confidentiality?
Yeah, that to me that's actually really, so when I was at Nuance, we did a lot of remote testing because of course a lot of it was over the phone call center kind of things. And there are a lot of benefits of doing remote testing, right? Especially if you're doing something that's going to be just voice only and over the phone. You don't need you kind of prefer to have a person in their own environment, right? And you also can reach more people that way. So we had, a lot of ways to just sort of set it up so we can, tap in and talk to people, and all the sort of confidentiality and NDAs and things like that. It's all something that you can cover beforehand while you're actually getting your participants ready. And then just make sure that when you're starting the session that you kind of reiterating everything about, we're about to record, is this okay? Okay, I'm going to start the recording now. And if somebody seems to, and I mean, you can do a lot also without actually having people use their own information, right? So I did this prescription refill study ages ago. And what we wanted to see is how long it would take people to actually go and fetch the information that you would need to do the refill. So we, asked people to go and get whatever they usually look at, if it's some card or the bottle or something like that, right? But then we were very clear, don't actually tell us what the number is. You're going to use this fake number instead to go on, right? So that kind of thing. You have to sort of balance getting something that's as concrete as possible and realistic as possible without actually forcing people to use their own information. That makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, Amanda, do you have thoughts on this? Any strategies?
Yeah, I mean, even like phone's one piece, even just doing a Zoom call and having, no cameras on, so you can't kind of focus on facial expressions, or, you don't want to feed off that. You don't want to look at them, right? Because the solution won't be able to, like the voice experience isn't going to have eyes to kind of, react to. So I think that's you could easily do it that way. From the confidentiality piece, there's third parties, like usertesting.com, where you don't know who the users are. You might just have a username that, so you can go through third parties to kind of set up, use them as a medium to set up those video calls without the cameras turned on. And then you have, and those users would answer a series of questions ahead of time to make sure that they match your user persona, so that the feedback you're getting from them is relevant to the solution that you're building and the users that you are going to build and design for. Oh, I think you're muted now.
Whoops. Thanks, Amanda. So we have a few questions coming in as well. Will Kessling, you asked, what sort of things do you look for in research that point you to chat versus using other methods for solving user goals? If I'm understanding correctly, you're asking, how do you do research to figure out whether a conversational UI is actually the best tool to solve that user's problem? Would you mind chatting in and letting us know if that's what you meant with that question? And then we are gonna go on to the next one. Taylor, what are the minimum viable research requirements to still be able to design with confidence for tight client budgets?
Yeah, minimum viable research requirements. I would actually think about this maybe a little bit differently. And instead of maybe focusing on MVRs, if we can call them that, MVRs, I would instead like consider if you have a tight budget, think about how maybe you can conduct like guerrilla user research. A really great example, we actually just did this recently for a Facebook chat. We ended up creating a fictitious Facebook profile and a fictitious company page from that profile. And then we used a Wizard of Oz style of testing to pretend like we were the chatbot with a participant on the other end, and ultimately like we did through a service like use recruitment for participants. So we did pay for those. But that's an example of a way that you could conduct user research without, let's say you recruited a friend instead. That's a way you could conduct research without paying anything for it.
Oh, that's an interesting solution.
I love that you said Wizard of Oz testing. I wish I could do it more. It comes up right, before development, but after design, and often the client's like, let's just get it out there. And I'd love to do more of it. But yeah, you can do Wizard of Oz testing with, you have someone on Messenger, or it's a WhatsApp conversation. You have cue cards. If you were playing the bot, you have cue cards you can only say what are on those cue cards. I love it. I think it's so effective. And just if you don't mind me adding to the question, if this is an existing bot, use data, use transcripts. That is your user research. They are users giving you feedback about the experience already. So I just wanted to add that in, especially if there is a solution that you're optimizing or you're adding to, and also who is already interfacing with those users that you're designing and building for. Are they live agents? Talking to them, that's low cost, right? You just speak to, they have a really good idea of what are customers asking, what are their problems. Getting feedback from them is really critical.
Totally agree. Both those. I mean, I love Wizard of Oz studies, and they're really stressful sometimes if you're you're the wizard, right? Because you want to really do a good job.
You have to look through your cue cards. You're like, do I have an
exactly? I know, you have to really practice, but it's a fantastic tool, right? And because you can really also force a certain behavior on a user and see what happens instead of say, what if, and then hopefully it will happen. Right? But so that's great, and absolutely observe. There's so much you can do even if you don't have a big budget. You just, like Amanda said, any kind of observation, right? Find out, depending on what it is you're doing, if it's something that's a retail thing, well, then make sure that you go and observe people in that, maybe be one yourself, right? Experience whatever the stuff is, see what's there now, what are the tools. There's so many ways that you can find out, the current situation, what people are facing now, what's missing. Yeah. You mainly, I think if you want to have a certain kind of participants and you need to go through, but a lot of work to actually find those specific participants, that's a different story, but that's usually not something that's going to be something you're facing if you're, in a situation where you don't have a budget, right? So no, there's tons you can do. And it's equally valid to more expensive ones too.
Does anyone want to attempt to answer Will's question about using research to determine whether chat or voice is actually the best problem or best UI to solve someone's problem?
Is this question about is it pointing to chat or voice, or is it pointing to a conversational solution or not a conversational solution?
If I'm understanding,
I think it's the latter.
Conversation versus not conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll speak to this. And I've talked about it a lot before, but I think it's just so important, prioritizing your use cases. And because a bot, you can add so many use cases to a bot or a voice solution. It doesn't mean it's the best place for that. So, understanding, are people even talking about this use case today? Because if they're not, you're going to have to kind of direct traffic to, hey, there's this bot that answers these questions, but is anyone even asking the questions? Also, if interaction that customers are having today, or this problem or this issue, if it's not brief and it's quite lengthy and quite complicated, it's going to be really challenging to put that in a chat solution or a voice solution. You want to really prioritize brief, minimal back and forth dialogue. If it's going to take 20 steps for someone to get to the solution or solve a problem or complete the task, it might be really challenging to design for that, because there's so many areas that a user can fall out of the flow, and then they're going to have to get back in, and you're going to have so many areas of potential friction or conversation repair. And you know, really looking at, is this use case like quite complicated? Is it quite, you know, and also is there like, maybe it's a great problem that a bot can solve, but let's think about technical feasibility too. Do we have the technology to make sure that it is a better experience today? Do we have APIs to make sure that, you know, if people are manually inputting information to dictate, you know, where the experience is, web experience, app experience is taking them, and we want to make that faster with, you know, leveraging APIs or further integrations, we need to understand how technically feasible that is, because like I mentioned before, if today takes 5-7 steps on a website, and we have technical limitations, it's going to take 7, 8, 9 steps with a bot. That's not a good use case for a chatbot. Let's focus on updating the website or updating the app or whatever the channel is today. So that's what I would look at.
Yeah, and I would add to what Amanda said, like regarding like the technical feasibility, like there's also like the maintenance of like the chat experience itself, which is huge, right? You know, I've, and Will, this one might be a little familiar to you, you know, in the case of like FAQ bots or bots that are serving like a sort of a library function, you know, where they're just like a repository of information, you know, what ends up happening is you tend to get stuck in this place where you're trying to maintain information in one place and then trying to maintain it like in 2 other places as well, right? So that way the chatbot, through some means, is always reflecting what's on a website or some other thing. And what we found is that that's actually like incredibly like laborious, right? It's a lot of work, and what we found in some previous studies is that it's often actually not worth the effort. You know, instead, if you can have a really capable search function somewhere, like that is oftentimes a better solution that requires a lot less work.
Absolutely. If you're not willing for that to invest in that and to maintain, it's not a set it and forget it solution ever. If you don't have, you know, that economic viability piece to it, then yeah, you're right. Absolutely right. It shouldn't be prioritized.
I think exactly. It's kind of a 2-part thing. Maybe if somebody said, "Oh, we want to have a chatbot or a voice solution for problem X," right? First, start with saying, "Well, look, here are the reasons why this might not be a good fit," and mention all these things that Amanda and Taylor mentioned, and depending on what it is, right? Or maybe, and it could be things like, well, what this person is going to be in a different country and they don't have access, you know, they don't, or, you know, they have no internet connection. Very close to my current mind here. But, you know, or you're proposing a chatbot solution, but they're in a chat or a hands-free, eyes-free kind of situation, so they can't use it, or whatever it is, right? List all those kinds of things first, and then if people really insist, well, then you start doing user testing and prototypes and get people's feedback in as realistic as an environment as possible, right? And we can really see, now look, this really is a problem. This is not your best solution, and then you go back to saying, here's probably your better options.
Yeah, it seems to really be grounded in the context of, you know, the hardware, the software, the
Yeah, exactly.
situational context, all of it really plays into them. Taylor, how do you combine qualitative and quantitative data with each other?
Yeah, I really like data. I think it's really important. You know, whether we're talking conversation design or really any sort of like UX design under the tree. A great example of how we've combined it in a recent study, we were running usability on a chatbot, and we had the user run through two different tasks. At the end of each task, we asked a qualitative question, something really open-ended, like tell us like what you thought of that experience. Just to, again, sort of get a sense of how they're thinking about it. And then after that, we asked 2 quantitative based questions that were like surveys, on a scale of 1 to 5, like how usable did you think this chat experience was? On a scale of 1 to 5, how useful did you think it was? So I found that was a really efficient way to get both that qualitative and quantitative data.
Yeah, nice. You really kind of hit both of those where you can look at, the combined, average number of like, wow, if everyone said 1, then clearly there's something wrong. But by asking for that, that general feedback, you may be able to hone in on certain issues that you can't capture in just like a 1 to 7 scale. Taylor, do you have any experience getting qualitative feedback through voice or like a voice recording versus typing? And if so, has that changed like the amount of feedback you get or the usefulness of it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Brielle. I think there's something interesting about what somebody says versus what somebody does. And I think that's an interesting distinction sometimes between voice and chat. And that's sort of rooted in this idea that, right, what people say is often maybe a little bit different from their actual behavior. And so I guess that's the difference that I would try and convey. And I think for that reason, it can be useful to get both. Assuming that like you're building like an omni-channel sort of an experience, I think what you would learn from what somebody might dictate to a bot versus what they might type out to them, I think it can be quite different and useful for that reason.
Anne, thoughts on how you combine qualitative and quantitative data?
Yeah, no, more data is better. And like I agree with Taylor. I think it's important also to try to educate the audience of your studies, right? So try to explain the difference between what you're going to get out of the qualitative and the quantitative. And also, just because it's a number doesn't mean it's quantitative, right? I mean, what I mean by that is if you have like, 8 people in your usability study, you want to avoid things like saying, well, 75%, did this, right? Versus maybe you can just say something else and said, the majority of people did this or something like that, or just to kind of de-emphasize that this was a small number and that's not the focus of the usability study. But then combine it also with things that are really larger data studies, right? Where you have some sort of automated survey and stuff. And that brings on its own issues, of course. If Amanda and Taylor, if you've done a lot of the sort of larger, send out a big survey that collects some kind of relevant data points. But then oftentimes you have to find ways there to make sure that people don't just sort of say, okay, I'm going to just say yes to everything or, give 5 to everything, whatever, right? So that I can get through it really fast and get my, little payment, whatever it is that I get for doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you can get so much out of both and you want to do both. And you just have to make sure that you remember what you get out of the qualitative versus the quantitative. So.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, why don't we really quickly revisit that question about intents? Does anyone want to attempt any thoughts about how to conduct research in order to model your intent system?
My first thought, and Anne and Amanda, feel free to like interrupt and chime in here. My first thought is like ethnography, like, right? Like what does this bot actually have to do, right? And that's really based on what maybe you observe from your user. Like which critical tasks like does your user need to complete on a daily basis? That you can observe through ethnography that will ultimately like dictate how you map your intents, if that makes sense.
And can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by ethnography? Like, how would you actually carry that out?
Yeah, I mean, if at all possible, like if you can take, even like a couple hours to literally shadow like a user and observe them in their habitat, right, in their everyday environment, and again, be able to sort of study those critical tasks that they have to perform on a daily basis. I think the observation of how they complete those tasks can help inform not only, again, the intensity you want to ultimately map out, but how you'd want to map them out.
Mhm.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the only thing I would add too is I like when I first heard that question, I was like, oh, I would flip the switch. I would, understand what the data is to inform the problem. And then based on, engaging and researching or getting feedback from users about that problem, then that would inform my intents. So I would let data lead the way and feedback lead the way, and then kind of finalize what my intents would be based on that feedback.
Yeah,
Okay.
it seems like there's kind of two starting points. Like either you already have
Right.
a body of data of, people chatting maybe with humans or a bot, and you can say, okay, here are the patterns we're identifying with what people are saying and asking. Or you don't have any of that and you're just starting from scratch. You have to kind of predict what they're going to ask and say. And if that's the case, then Amanda, kind of what you're saying is that you do your best, you think about what kind of makes sense in this context, this scenario, you organize the intents like that, and then you just gotta iterate based on the new requests you're seeing coming in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you could go either way.
Well, we have about 5 minutes. There was one question that I really liked, which was, what is the one question nobody ever asks about UX research for conversational products? And I think all of you were open to answering that. So, Anne, do you want to go first?
No, let me think about it for a moment. I will answer it though, but
Okay.
actually, let me ask a question back. Do you mean actually the question of like, who's asking the question? The researcher, the people interested in doing it?
So I interpret it as like, if I'm interested in doing research eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, but I guess you could go either way. Amanda, you wanted to start off?
I interpret it as, if I'm conducting research, what's the question that isn't being asked before I conduct the research? And it was brought up earlier in this chat, but is a conversational solution the right thing? I just find businesses will be like, we need a chatbot, we need a virtual assistant, everyone has one, we should have one. And we skip the step. We just make the assumption that this is the best medium to solve the problem. Like, let's take our time and figure out, do people even want it? Are people even talking about the thing we're trying to, build? Do we have the investment to support it ongoing? Is it technically feasible? Like, do we have the resources to make it even better than current state and more efficient and more faster, better, all those fun things. I just find, I have found that businesses will be like, yes, we're doing it. And there hasn't been enough research and effort and time to think, is this medium, is this channel the best? Or maybe you just need to update your website. Maybe, maybe your client portal just needs a little bit more UI love and some additional UX, enhancements. Because again, if there's an app doing a thing that customers get, like a banking app, but you want to you want to redirect that traffic to make them go over here, they're used to going over here. It has to be better. It has to be, and it can't be clunkier. It can't be longer or slower, because customers are going to get frustrated if you're really trying to divert that traffic to whatever they're using today.
Totally agree. Absolutely. And I would also say that another question would be for me is the kind of questioning the data. This is a different slant on it, but if you see any kind of results or survey or something that says, oh, all these people like this thing, then the question, and this is of course a very hard question to actually answer. Well, but first the question should be, what were the real questions that were asked? I could look at the question that people heard or the participants were given, right? And then like, who were these? Were they self-selected? What was the context? You know, how was it asked? When was it asked? Did they understand what it was referring to? You know, a lot of times people say, oh, everybody uses, you know, a speech app. Well, it turns out that for a lot of people, that means, do you dictate to your phone? And I put that in a different category compared to actually interacting with something with a conversational design, right? And just like, do people really like stuff that you think they like? And how do we figure that out? I mean, those super hard questions, right? But that's what's really interesting. How do we know what people really want them like longitudinally and things like that?
I love this question because I think it reflects how easily everyone can interpret something differently, right? And reflects all of our our personal biases and like lenses by which we view things, because I interpreted this question totally differently from everyone as well. I took it more as like, in the world of like UX research, like what's a research question that like nobody's like taking the time to like dig into or explore, and we should be. And I have some personal motivations there, admittedly, of course. But Brielle, this actually came from a conversation that you and I had at the beginning of the year. And it's regarding confidence thresholds, you know, and like natural language processing and understanding, you know, and my question is, you know, as AI becomes more and more sophisticated, I want folks to start talking about and researching, you know, at which thresholds or at which points will we begin seeing the use of conversational interfaces in like highly sensitive use cases? You know, and when I say highly sensitive use cases, I mean like in the operating room and like maybe in like space. That's the question I'm really interested in.
Yeah, very good questions, very specific context too. All right, well, it is the top of the hour. I don't want to keep my panelists or attendees any longer than this, but that was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. And thanks for tuning in. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good rest of your Thursday and hope to see everyone at the next AMA. All right,
Thanks.
be safe.
Thanks, Brielle.